Welcome back to episode 101 of the Shirley Special. Today, I'm joined by Andrew, Jake, Luca, and Carson to add on to our discussion about Slaughterhouse-5 from episode 100. Let's get right into this. Last week, we talked about the events in Billy's life and how they affected the story and how we interpreted each chapter. Now that we've all finished Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5, what's changed?
Well, I can tell you what's changed, Nick, and it's that, last week, we really didn't have the understanding of the plot that we do now. See, I think when we talked last week, we thought, how does Billy's past influence his present, and how does his present influence his future? And one thing we didn't realize was that the plot is written the way it is on purpose. The plot is written in the timey-wimey way because, well, Billy's life is not defined by dominoes falling over. His story is told by the things we see everywhere in his life. It's about who he became.
I think that oftentimes when you read books in English classes, you'll wait for like the climax, it's like slow, getting more information, then like the climax of the story, and then it kind of the downfall. And I think a lot of us were expecting that in this book, but in reality, like, there is no one climax in the book. Yes, Dresden is what you all thought it was, but in reality, each chapter is special.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry. You can go ahead, Jacob, if you're going.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, we start out, we know exactly what the climax is supposed to be. Derby gets shot. That's what he tells us outright. That's what the climax of the book is supposed to be. And it all sort of leads up to that point. But whenever we get there, he barely even spends a sentence on it. He just says, Derby was shot. So it goes. So that's
how it goes.
Yeah, I think the whole book leads the audience on the mystery of it, geez. The whole book leads the audience on mysteries. So throughout the whole book, the audience is wondering what's going on with the main character, and it's leading up to the events of Dresden. But once you finish the book, I think you more look on the perspective of the book as a whole. Billy isn't defined by the events of Dresden. He's defined by his whole life and the experiences he's had as a whole.
I think that's a really good point. Luca, do you have anything to add on to this?
Well, here's what I'll say. I do think I agree with what Jake said. He said something along the lines of Edgar Derby, that being the climax of the book, was talked about all from the beginning. And when we got to it, he got maybe a paragraph of text about him getting shot because he alluded to a teapot. And there's something about that. I mean, Edgar stood up against Howard J. Campbell when he was, talking about how American politics are terrible and how we need to destroy the Russians. And Edgar Derby was the only one who stood up and basically stood up for his country and stood up for his integrity. And for him to die for stealing a teapot, that's a different way to go than I think any of us were expecting from this book about war.
Yeah, it almost sort of reflects the pointlessness of war almost, because we're all the protagonists of our own story. Derby views himself as the hero, but sometimes just senseless things happen. He's just another name in the line of casualties at the end of the book.
Now, I think those are all really good points. Now, last week we talked a little bit about how some things that you would think that would really affect Billy don't affect him at all. We spent some time talking about Lazaro and how he essentially told Billy he was going to show up at his house and Billy better not open the door. And how do you think now finishing the book and knowing the full story affects how you look at Billy's philosophy on life?
I think in chapter 9, I'm pretty sure it's 9, we get that moment that Billy is in the hospital and he's really quiet. The person next to him thinks he's brain dead and doesn't exist anymore. And Billy's just sort of listening in. And we get that defining moment when Billy finally wants to speak about Dresden. It says during that whole time in the hospital, he's coming up with the thoughts of Traufeldor and thinking everything up. And at that final moment, he decides he wants to share. He goes to New York And I think over the book as a whole, we get to see that philosophy like throughout it.
Yeah, it really sort of opens up Billy throughout the book because, he wouldn't even tell his wife that much about the war. If you remember from that one chapter, they were in bed and she asked him, what did you do in the war? How was it? And he just gave her like as simple of an explanation as possible, trying to sort of keep it hidden.
Mm-hmm.
I think a point in this story that kind of was eye-opening for me, and I think Carson might be able to add on to this a little bit, and maybe the rest of you guys can too, is when Billy's in the hospital and there's a media reporter next to him. Billy's just found out that his wife's dead, and he doesn't really acknowledge that at all. He's telling his story about Dresden to this media reporter, and the media reporter is just not interested in it about that, like not interested at all. I think that really sheds some light on how like the media controls what the public knows happens in war, and seeing what we know about Billy from 10 chapters and then seeing how the media reporter just doesn't want to put that out there because like maybe it's not the right light to put on. What do you guys have to say about that?
Well, going back on this note of how all this rising action and how it's not present here, or if it is, it's like spread out and it's mixed with the climax and the falling action. You see how if you try and take the events that are given to us and put them back in chronological order, you see how he's numb. He's kind of numb throughout his entire life. Because I guess even throughout his childhood, he had to be numb because of the fear he experienced at the beginning. So he grew to just act like he's not feeling anything.
Yeah, so a lot of times I guess we've heard people in class and reading our classmates' stuff about how Billy has no fear, when in reality, Billy is so fearful that he's just numb.
Yeah.
That's a really great point.
Yeah, and I feel like this numbness continues, like you were saying about his wife. When his wife asks about him, he doesn't say anything, but this numbness continues till that accident. And he wakes up in the hospital and he feels like he wants to talk about this Tralfamadoran experience. So maybe his thoughts finally found a place where he could make sense of it, because before he couldn't make sense of the pain. One note that was said about a woman, I think it was in chapter 6 or 7, that she said, yes, all the real soldiers are already dead. Because when she comes in the kitchen, there's a really young man, a really old man, and then there's Billy dressed as Cinderella. And so you realize how everything is so odd. It's not what you expect it to be. And I guess this is how the expectations, none of them are actually real. And so he has a lot of deceptions. And so he's trying to find reason where the world gives him a totally different one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of it too is when you think about Tralfamador, like going about how when Billy's on Earth and he's numb and he's fearful, and we really think he has no fear, but then it talks about what he's done on Tralfamador, and he essentially has like a wife, and then she gets pregnant, and now she has a 6-month kid, and it's like clearly he is not very fearful of Tralfamador. He's having all these emotions there and has a kid there, and
yeah,
definitely a different.
And
like,
in that environment, he does talk to Montana about the war, unlike he did with his wife on Earth.
Yeah, when she asked for a story, that's right.
So I guess it was like the relationship he imagined, the one he wanted versus the one he got.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Maybe that's sort of what Billy had envisioned for his life. That's what, he was trying to go for, but then, the war happened and it all sort of got put on hold. It could be a reflection of his past self almost.
I think something we should definitely address this episode is that although Billy knows that these events are coming up, he's like, the bombing doesn't happen today, it happens tomorrow. And he doesn't do anything to change them. Like he's accepted them and he's just reliving them. Well, I know someone had asked, one of our fans had sent in a letter and they had said, like, is when Billy's traveling in time, this is the first time he's living each of these moments. And in actuality, it's not.
Yeah.
I think to respond to that, it's definitely a situation of he is looking back on his life when he says he's time traveling. So
yeah, with
hindsight, of course, he knows that the things are going to happen. But living in those memories, he can't have known those things were going to happen. But I will say, I think a strong element of this story was what we tell ourselves the war is about. Because Billy is just the only character, I think, who doesn't really look at the war under some kind of scope that it's not actually under. Whereas everyone else, all the real soldiers are dead. You look at Kurt Vonnegut and you have to wonder why, if he was in the war, Kurt Vonnegut was in this war, and he says he was with Billy, but Billy's a fictional character. Why is Kurt Vonnegut using Billy as a way to tell the story? And it's because Kurt Vonnegut thinks that people like Rumford, who Billy shared a hospital room with, they are the ones controlling the narrative about our history. And when
Carson, I don't
they
mean to cut you off, but we're coming up on 10 minutes, and I want to let Miss Hilliard know and everybody else watching that if you want to see the rest of this podcast, we're going to upload it. It's called the Shirley Podcast, episode 101. And we have one more topic we're going to talk about after Carson gets done with this one. All right, Carson, continue.
So people like Rumford, they will control the story that's told about history. And basically, to finish off this point, if Kurt Vonnegut doesn't tell what really happened about the Children's Crusade, then the people who can sit at home and say, oh, that was a necessary bombing, that ended the war, so stuff like that. People who can sit at home and say that stuff, they feel conflicted when they're sitting next to someone who was a victim of that choice, and they don't want to talk about it.
I think that's a great point. And the last topic I want to address, because I just feel like we can't, this is probably going to be our last Slaughterhouse 5 podcast. Everybody can write in on what we want our next podcast to be about, but I think we need to address the elephant in the room, Pootie Wheat.
Pootie Wheat.
Yep, that's the last thing you ever hear from the book,
And I think it's only right if we end the podcast like that. So what do you boys think about Pootie Wheat? I think that for me, it almost seems right that would be how the book ends. Like, there is no acceptable response to war. There is no acceptable. If you have someone who's lost someone in war or lost something, you don't want to go up to them and be like, it's okay. It's, just like there is no good response to death in war.
Yeah.
What do you guys have to say about that?
I think it just results in the numbness of war almost. There's not really, like you said, anything good to say about a war or anything bad to say. I feel like it's a topic nobody really wants to talk about. So I think the author just ends the book on that, for the audience, to think about all that has just happened throughout the book. The author doesn't want to flat out say what the book is about or answer the questions the audience may have directly, and it sort of ends on that. Just like you don't want to say much about war, or there isn't really good anything to say. The author doesn't really have anything good to say about the book besides the audience thinking about it all in their head.
Yeah, exactly. It certainly does give us a lot to talk about. So just ending it on that open note, it leaves it open for your own analysis, really. And it also sort of serves as a contrast. You were just getting bombed. Everything's exploding. There are fires everywhere shooting. And then at the end of the book, it's just silence, nature, and you hear the bird.
Yeah, when you think about birds chirping and nature, you think about that's one of the most peaceful things in the world is nature and birds just chirping and being happy.
And on that note of nature being peaceful, let's see if I can say this without confusing. But the war was about higher ideals, was about spreading democracy, or in this case, defeating the Nazis. But I guess what you realize at the end is that it gets too complicated. And after the war, you should be able to not have to complain about the bad, but be able to console in what the good is, which is how simple and nature has its own course.
I think you just said that in a really good way about using the word complicated. War is complicated. There is no way to simplify it. It's complicated.
It's got a greater impact than we could ever imagine.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're given examples of, really nice German citizens throughout the whole book. The innkeepers that took in the Americans whenever they were going through the ruins. They gave them food and they said, good night, Americans. It gives a good contrast because, you have Campbell and he's, the traditional villain. He was an American, he's a Nazi now. And it serves as a contrast showing that, not everything is black and white. Some of the Americans are awful people. You look at Weary, you look at Lazaro, and, they're very clearly disgusting, awful people. So it's sort of, a lot of the war books, Americans, we're the good side, the Germans are the bad side, and there's not a whole lot of in between. Mm-hmm. I think this book sort of provides that contrast.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, boys, it's been another great episode of the Shirley Podcast. We want to just thank all the viewers out there for supporting us and writing in and supporting the podcast. We have no sponsors today, but we are ready to support the brand.
Before we go, I'd just like to thank Nick for having us on, again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, boys. Hope to see you guys next week.
Peace out.